What's up, youth? How are we doing tonight? Are y'all happy to be in this room? Last week was awesome. Y'all did so good inviting all of your friends and just having a great time, just focusing on what the moment was and focusing on God through it all. So give yourself a round of applause. All right, so over the last couple of weeks, we've been going through this series talking about New Year, same who? God. Wait, New Year, same who? God. New Year, same God. And our series scripture comes from Hebrews 13:8. And it says, Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and how long? Wait, how long? Forever. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So it might be a new year, but we still serve the same God. And so we're going to talk a little bit tonight about God's never changing promises, right? So we're going to talk through the story of Abraham. Trick question, who knows Abraham's original name? What is it? Abram, right? Awesome. So we're going to be talking about the story of Abraham. So that's going to be Genesis 12 all the way through Genesis 22. I'm not going to read it all to you. Don't worry. But I want to kind of talk about a little bit my sermon title tonight. So my sermon title is Pinky Promise. But it's not just Pinky Promise, it's Pinky Promise, right? So just for a little bit of context, growing up, I'm old. I'm an old man. You can call me Old Man Saul. I'm way older than y'all. And growing up might not be the same for y'all, but pinky promises were a big deal. Were they a big deal for y'all? Yeah, so are they still a big deal? No. Okay, so they used to be a big deal. And so growing up for me, that was a big deal. And so I'd make these pinky promises, whether it's with my family, my friends, my parents, whatever it was. And so that was a thing. And so once I got to a certain age, I was like, there's no point in making any pinky promises. I'm a man. My word is my bond. I'm gonna be a man of my word. And then I got married. Yeah, marriage changes everything. And my wife still likes doing pinky promises. It's weird, I'm like, you're a grown woman. But she still likes doing pinky promises. There's something about it to her where if that's the case, if we do a pinky promise, and if I break it, it's a bad day for me. But I've learned with her that if she wants to do a pinky promise, that it is a big deal. It means a lot. And that I have to make sure I do everything in my power to hold up my end of the bargain. And so there will be these moments in our household where we'll be talking about certain things, whether it's, our future or certain situations we're going through, whatever's happening. And while we're talking, I bring my side of the argument. She brings her side. I know what I want out of it. And so we're talking through it. And oftentimes she has the more logical ways. She has the more logical answers. She thinks through it a little bit harder than I do. And so we'll come to these conclusions where she's like, okay, are you on the same page with me? And I'm like, I am. Like, you've brought some good points. She goes, pinky promise. And so I know in that moment, I'm gonna pinky promise her, I better hold up my end of the bargain. I better do everything I can to make sure I do and follow through with what we just talked about. So why does that relate to this? It relates to it because as I'm reading the story of Abraham, I see multiple times where God has shown him, God has promised Abraham, given him all the tools, told him what's gonna happen, and yet Abraham was like, pinky promise? Are you sure? You pinky promise me? Are you sure you're gonna follow through with it the entire time? And so we're gonna talk through that a little bit, the different stories in which Abraham was like, but you promised me this, when is it gonna happen? Or, oh, God, how is that gonna happen? It seems impossible. Anybody in this room, sometimes things seem a little bit impossible? You're like, how is that gonna happen? Maybe you're like, whoa, I was expecting this to happen now, but you're sitting there waiting on God's timing. Anybody? Yeah, it happens a lot. And so tonight we're gonna be talking through that a little bit. So first, we're gonna be speaking through Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3. And I'm gonna give you a summary. We're gonna read some more scripture in a second, but I'm gonna give you a summary of this. So God spoke to Abraham. Who did God speak to? Abraham. And when God spoke to Abraham at this time, at this moment, at this point in his life, was just an ordinary man. He was just an ordinary man. He was living in unfamiliar land, and he had no idea what his future was. Anybody here ever worried about their future? Okay, we're gonna talk about that a little bit. So he was in unfamiliar land. He didn't know who he was. He didn't know what was gonna happen in his future, but God came to Abraham. And he promised him 3 things: land, descendants, and blessings. He promised Abraham so many descendants that it would outnumber the stars in the sky. That it would outnumber the stars in the sky. That's a lot of stars to outnumber. That's a lot of people to come into this earth. And he said that it would outnumber that. He said, I will give you this land and blessings. And at that time, to be Abraham, you're like, I'm just a dude. I'm just a guy. I'm in an unfamiliar land. I don't even know what my future holds. But God's coming to him. He says, you've got land coming to you. You've got descendants. You've got all these blessings coming to you. And it seemed impossible. Has God ever placed a dream or given you a promise where it seemed a little bit impossible? Where you're like, I don't know if that's gonna work. I can't see that actually happening. Given where I am today, I don't know how I'm gonna get to that place. One day when I was y'all's age, a long time ago, because remember, I'm old man Saul, I was on a missions trip to El Salvador with my youth group. And they had this prayer room that there was 24 hours of prayer, 365 days a year. There was never not somebody praying in that room. So it was a holy place. The presence of the Lord was there. And so as I was on that trip, the mission team, we all got together and we got to go into this prayer room. And as we were in this prayer room, I was feeling a different way. I was like, you know what, God, I'm tired of doing this. I'm tired of living a life that isn't for you. And some lady came up to me and she prophesied over my life. She told me that I was gonna be a pastor one day. I blew her off. I said, you're crazy. That's impossible. You have no idea what I do. You have no idea who I am. Sometimes things seem impossible. Abraham was at a point where it just seemed impossible for what God promised him to happen. It may seem impossible, but who is in control? Who's in control? Who promised it? And if God promised it, he is going to fulfill that promise. God, Jesus Christ, was the same yesterday, today, and forever, and he will never not follow through on a promise that he has given you. Just like Abraham, there's often times in our lives where we get filled with doubts. We wonder maybe, are we good enough? Are we capable? Can I even do this? It seems like who I am, like to do that, what you've called me to do, God, it just seems like it's not gonna work. It seems impossible. But even when we doubt, God remains faithful. Just like how he never changes, his promises to us never change. And the challenges that we face today do not diminish God's ability to fulfill what he has spoken over our lives. And so sometimes it just feels like, how am I going to get there? But we have to understand, we serve a God who does the impossible. What we see as, we can't do that, you're right. We can't do that, but he can. We serve a God who is going to open doors, who is going to fulfill those promises even when it looks grim. His timing is perfect. Who here likes waiting in line? What? I hate waiting in line. It's not for me. I don't like it. I'm a very impatient person. It's just who I am. Sundays, during football season, I told you all this before, I like to go home. I like to watch 7 hours of commercial-free football. It's my favorite thing. I enjoy it. I sit in my living room. But this year's a little bit different because now I have a son, right? So I've got another little responsibility that I've got to, partner with my wife and take care of. My son loves the TV remote. We have a little cover on it. It's orange, so he sees it from a mile away. He'll be on the other side of the house. He'll see it. He'll crawl as fast as he can. He'll climb up whatever he needs to get to that remote. And I'm a little bit impatient, y'all. Sometimes my son can be a little bit annoying. Just a little bit. Because I'm sitting there trying to watch football, and he grabs the remote and changes the channel. Then on top of that, I take the remote away from him, and what does he do? He cries. He cries, just like Will does when I beat him in Gaga Ball. But he cries, right? Sometimes I don't have that patience. Sometimes it can be a little bit difficult for me to wait on that timing for him to be done crying so I can turn my football on, so I put it on my phone. I adapt, I find ways. But sometimes we have to wait on timing that is out of our control. Timing that we aren't in charge of. Timing that can only be fulfilled by who? Fulfilled by who? And so we read in Genesis 17, years passed, still Abraham and Sarah didn't have a child. At times, they tried to make things happen on their own. Abraham went out. He tried to make things happen and have a child that God promised him. It didn't work out. It wasn't who the child God had promised him and Sarah. He took the matters into his own hands. But God's promise, the promises that he has placed within us, don't depend on what we do. It doesn't depend on our effort as a human. It doesn't depend on our timing. It is solely on his timing. And as we read in Genesis 17, verses 15 through 19, it says this. And God said to Abraham, as for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall become nations. Kings of peoples shall come from her. In verse 17, it continues, it said, then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. God said, no. And I love this part because Ishmael is the son he had that wasn't with his wife. And God says this, no, but Sarah, your wife. He kind of took a dig at him right there. He said, but Sarah, your wife, that one, shall bear your son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for the offspring after him. God's promise didn't depend on what Abraham went and did to try to make his own timeline instead of following and waiting for what God had for him. God waited until it was absolutely clear that only he could make it happen. And when Abraham was 99 years old, how old was he? God reminded him of this covenant. What's a covenant? It's a promise between God, right? Between you and God. God reminded him of his covenant and gave him the child that he promised. And what was his name? His name was Isaac. And we read in Psalm 20, verse 7, it says, some trust in chariots and some in horses. But who? But who? We trust in the name of the Lord our God. Our trust shouldn't be put into other men. It shouldn't be put into ourselves and what we can do to fulfill the promises that God has planned for us. It should be solely put into God. Sometimes we think about and think that God's promises should happen right now. We live in this world where everything's fast food, where we go, we order it, we get it now. But that's not how it works. That's not how it works. Sometimes you have to wait until you're actually ready to take on that next responsibility, to take on what God has promised for you. I know when my wife and I first got married, I wanted a son, I wanted kids immediately. I wanted a son. I got my son. But I wanted kids immediately. I was ready for it. My wife was like, no. So we held off. And then later, we were able to have Mo. And he's great. He's a blessing. But now I realize that having Mo 2 years ago, almost 3 years ago, I wouldn't have had the same patience, the same care, and the same love that I do for him now. I wouldn't have the patience to change a poopy diaper 3 years ago than I do now. God has graced me and graced me for a season as this to be able to do it. And what that took was waiting on his timing. What that took was waiting for God to move and God to make a way rather than trying to do it all on my own. When you trust in God's timing, you gain a peace that even when it feels like nothing is happening, even when it feels like there's nothing going on and that you're still waiting, you know that God is in control. You have that full trust and faith in him. We have to be obedient to God. We have to trust and put our faith in him that he knows best for us, that he has a plan for us, and that he is going to follow through with it. Because God is not a God of empty promises. He will follow through and make sure that those things he has promised you come to pass. And we see later in the story of Abraham, Abraham had trust in God. God told him, hey, your one and only son that I gave you right now, I want you to take him and you're gonna sacrifice him. The one you waited on for so long, you're gonna take him and you're gonna sacrifice him. That's a tough thing to do. But Abraham had trust and faith that God was going to provide. And God didn't plan for anything to happen to Isaac. He was testing his faith to see if he would trust in the Lord. And he passed. We have to have obedience and trust and faith in God. And when we put our trust and we put our faith in God, everything will fall into place. And there will be a peace that surrounds us That we won't be worried about the timing of things happening. We won't worried about how impossible something might be. All we're focused on is God, who he is, and that he won't fail us. And that if he promised it, he's gonna follow through with it.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe here to check out our previous sermons, and make sure you go follow our other social channels on Facebook and Instagram.